There is a particular kind of silence that exists only in rooms where important things are about to be destroyed. I recognized it the moment I stepped through the glass door of Harrington Mediation Associates on the 14th floor of the Sovereign Building in downtown Hartford. It was a Tuesday in March, 9:17 in the morning, and the city outside the floor-to-ceiling windows was the color of old pewter, that specific New England gray that isn't quite winter and isn't quite anything else, just a long, flat holding pattern between one season and the next. The kind of gray that presses down on the city like a thought you can't quite finish. The elevator had smelled of someone else's coffee and expensive cologne. The hallway smelled of nothing, which is a smell that requires considerable effort and money to produce. The carpet was a deep charcoal. The walls a shade of white so carefully calibrated, it probably had a name like coastal mist or morning clarity. Everything about the 14th floor of the Sovereign Building had been designed to communicate. Whatever happens here will be conducted by reasonable adults in a reasonable manner. It was the aesthetic of controlled demolition. The receptionist looked up when I approached the desk. She had the kind of face that is trained into pleasantness. Not naturally pleasant, but professionally so, the way a flight attendant learns to smile through turbulence. She had been briefed. I could see it in the slight adjustment of her expression when she looked at me, the microscopic recalibration of someone who has been given a description and is now matching it against the reality. "Mrs. Whitmore?" she said. "Ms. Huang Ashford," I said, pleasantly. The way you correct a small error that is not worth making into something larger than it is, while making absolutely certain the correction registers. She blinked once. "Of course, I'm so sorry, Ms. Huang Ashford." She said my name carefully, the way people do when they are trying to prove they've heard you. "If you'll follow me, the mediation suite is ready." I had used that name, my full name, both halves of it hyphenated together, the Huang that came from my father's family in Taiwan, and the Ashford that Richard's mother had once suggested I simply drop, since it created such confusion at dinner parties, for 11 years of marriage. Richard had never loved it. He thought it was unnecessarily complicated, that it made introductions awkward at country club dinners, that it suggested a kind of divided loyalty he found vaguely unsettling in a wife. He had never said any of this directly. Richard rarely said anything directly. He preferred the architecture of implication, the carefully constructed sentence that meant 3 different things depending on how much attention you were paying, and that could always be walked back to its most innocent interpretation if challenged. I had always been paying attention. The receptionist led me down a hallway lined with abstract prints in muted blues and greens, the kind of art chosen specifically to communicate nothing, to exist in a room without asserting itself, to be the visual equivalent of hold music. 3 small watercolors of indeterminate coastal scenes. A lithograph of something that might have been a forest or might have been a dream of a forest. Everything carefully inoffensive. Everything carefully empty of meaning. The mediation suite was at the end of the hall. Double doors with frosted glass panels. Through the frosted glass, the amber blur of warm interior lighting. The low murmur of voices already inside. 2 voices, I thought, maybe 3. The soft consonants of a conversation being conducted in the register of people who have agreed, in advance, on what they intend to accomplish. I paused outside those doors. I want to be precise about this pause, because this story depends on precision, on the difference between what things look like and what they actually are, on the gap between the performance of a moment and its true content. The pause was not hesitation. It was not fear. I was not standing outside those frosted glass doors gathering courage or steadying my nerves or doing any of the things that a person pauses to do when they are not ready. I was running a final inventory. A surgeon pauses at the scrub sink, not because she doubts herself, but because she is disciplined, because she has learned that the cost of a missed step in preparation is paid later, at the worst possible moment, when there is no time to recover it. I had spent 8 months preparing for what was on the other side of those doors. I had built 300 pages of evidence. I had run every scenario, anticipated every counter-argument, constructed and deconstructed and reconstructed my case so many times that it existed in my mind as a complete architectural structure. Load-bearing walls, foundations, the specific points where pressure could be applied and where it needed to be distributed. I had not left anything to chance. 4 seconds. Then I pushed open the door. The mediation suite was everything the hallway had promised. Neutral, expensive, carefully designed to suggest that whatever happened within its walls would be reasonable and civilized and conducted between adults who respected each other. A long table of polished mahogany, the surface so well maintained that I could see a distorted reflection of the overhead lights in its surface. High-backed leather chairs in a deep charcoal gray, the leather soft and matte in the way of things that cost more than they look like they do. A credenza along the far wall with a silver coffee service, pot, cream, sugar, 4 cups on saucers, that nobody in the room was ever going to touch. Tall windows overlooking the city, the gray sky pressing down on everything like a judgment being withheld until further evidence could be gathered. Richard was already seated. He sat on the far side of the table, slightly off-center to his right, which placed him in the dominant position relative to the mediator's chair at the head. A positioning so deliberately casual that it was obviously deliberate. He had chosen his seat with the instincts of a man who has spent his entire adult life understanding that the physical arrangement of bodies in rooms is a form of argument. He was wearing the navy suit. I knew this suit the way you know the objects of a life shared, by the specific weight and texture of their presence, by what they mean in context. The navy brioni was Richard's armor of first resort. He wore it to investor presentations. He wore it to board meetings when he expected resistance. He had worn it to our first meeting with the attorney who drafted our prenuptial agreement, a document that, as it happened, was about to become considerably less useful to him than he anticipated, given that it had been structured around a financial disclosure that was, to use the technical legal term, fraudulent. The navy suit said, "I am a serious man. I am a powerful man. I am the kind of man whose word carries weight in rooms like this." The suit was, in this context, a form of comedy, though I did not smile. Beside him sat his mother. Eleanor Whitmore was 65 years old and had spent every one of those years constructing and maintaining an image of herself that was so comprehensive and so carefully maintained that it had, at some point, become indistinguishable from her actual personality. Or at least, this was what she had arranged for people to believe. She was a tall woman, still very straight-backed, with the kind of silver hair that is managed rather than allowed, and the kind of complexion that suggests a lifelong commitment to SPF and monthly facials. She wore a cream-colored wool dress, a Chanel, I recognized the cut, with a single strand of pearls at her throat and small pearl earrings that matched. She sat with the upright posture of a woman who had been told as a girl that slouching was a moral failing and who had never needed to be told twice. Her handbag, dark honey crocodile leather, Hermes, the kind of bag that people who want you to know they could afford it carry in such a way that suggests they don't think about it at all, rested on the table beside her folded hands, not in her lap, where a bag belongs when you are sitting at a table. On the table itself, beside her hands, like a second set of credentials. She had not been invited to this mediation. I noted this without expression, set my bag down beside the chair on my side of the table, and sat. At the head of the table, the mediator, Gerald Foss, according to the embossed silver nameplate positioned precisely at the center of his place, looked at me with the expression of a man who has been given incomplete information about a situation, and knows it, and has made peace with the knowledge that incomplete information is simply the condition of his work. He was a man in his early 60s, perhaps late 50s, with kind eyes behind frameless glasses and a gray suit that was neither expensive nor cheap. The suit of a man who has stopped performing for rooms a long time ago. His wedding ring had worn a groove into his finger that suggested at least 30 years of continuous wear. "Ms. Huang Ashford," he said. He pronounced my name correctly on the first attempt. "Thank you for coming this morning. Can I offer you coffee or water before we begin?" "Water would be wonderful, thank you," I said. He poured from a pitcher that had been placed near his right hand. The sound of water in a glass was very clear in the quiet room. Richard was watching me. He had been watching me in this particular way for 6 weeks, since the Tuesday evening in February when he had come home from a business trip to Miami carrying a dozen red roses and a carefully rehearsed expression of regret, and told me that our marriage had run its natural course and that he hoped we could handle the dissolution maturely and with mutual respect. He had watched me then with the focused attention of a man who is waiting to see how the person across from him responds to news that is designed to destroy them. He was looking for the grief, the shock, the dissolution of composure, the moment when the mask slips and the raw material underneath is exposed, and he can catalog it and use it. I had given him nothing then. I was giving him nothing now. I looked back at him with the expression I had been refining since approximately the age of 7, when I understood for the first time that the world would make certain assumptions about a small Chinese girl in a predominantly white New England school. Assumptions about her intelligence, her ambition, her right to take up space, and that the most powerful response to those assumptions was not to challenge them openly, which cost energy and invited conflict, but to quietly and consistently refuse to confirm them, which cost nothing and accumulated, over time, into a form of power that the people making the assumptions never saw coming. The expression was pleasant, attentive, revealing nothing. Daniel Park entered through a side door I hadn't noticed, carrying a leather portfolio and the specific quality of movement of someone who is accustomed to making entrances. He was 44, Korean-American, a graduate of Harvard Law who had built his reputation over 2 decades as the most effective divorce attorney in Connecticut for clients who could afford to win at any cost. He was not physically imposing, medium height, slim, with the kind of contained, precise energy of a person who has long since stopped wasting any of it. He wore a charcoal suit that was, I noted, almost certainly a chiton, and he had the hands of a person who does not do anything with them that he hasn't thought about first. He sat beside Richard without greeting me, opened his portfolio, and arranged 3 documents in a specific order in front of him. Then he looked up. "Ms. Huang Ashford," he said. "Thank you for making the time." The phrasing was chosen. Making the time suggests that my presence here is a concession, that I am doing them a favor by showing up, rather than that I have every legal and practical reason to be exactly where I am. It is the language of someone who is trying to establish, from the first sentence, a dynamic in which I am the supplicant. "Of course," I said. "I've been looking forward to it." A very small pause, almost imperceptible. But I had been watching Daniel Park move through rooms for the past 6 weeks, through the documents his firm had filed, through the deposition notices, through every piece of paper that bore his careful and considered fingerprints. And I knew that the pause was real. He had expected a different register. He had expected something more deferential. He would continue to expect things that didn't arrive for the next several weeks. "Shall we begin?" Gerald Foss said. Richard's proposed settlement had arrived by courier 3 days earlier, a thick manila envelope hand-delivered to my apartment by a young man in a bicycle helmet who asked me to sign for it with the particular cheerfulness of someone who has no idea what he is carrying. I had signed. I had tipped him $5. I had waited until he was in the elevator before I closed the door and stood in my hallway for a moment with the envelope in my hands. Then I had finished making Lily's oatmeal. She was 10 minutes from waking up, and she likes it with cinnamon and a small amount of brown sugar, and the blueberries arranged on top in a pattern that I had learned, through trial and error, needed to approximate a smiley face because she is 9 years old, and this matters. And I had packed her lunch and walked her to the bus stop and watched the yellow bus pull her away into the gray morning. And then I had walked back to the apartment and poured myself a second cup of coffee and sat down at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and read every single page of the proposed settlement. It took 2 hours and 40 minutes. The coffee went cold. I made more. That went cold too. I kept reading. Richard's settlement proposal was, in the language of someone who doesn't know what they're dealing with, aggressive. In the language of someone who does, it was a document that revealed a great deal about how its authors had assessed the opposition, which is to say that they had assessed me as someone who would read the first 3 pages, feel overwhelmed, and call an attorney friend for a referral, and that by the time any attorney was up to speed, Richard's legal team would have used the interim period to create additional facts on the ground. What they had not considered, what Richard had fundamentally, categorically failed to consider, despite 11 years of sharing a home and a table and a bed with me, was that I had spent 12 years becoming one of the foremost matrimonial asset specialists in New England, that I had handled 63 high-net-worth divorce cases with a settlement success rate that my former firm had used in their marketing materials, and that I had been reading proposed divorce settlements of this complexity since before Richard Whitmore had ever decided he wanted to know me. I read the proposed settlement. I noted every inconsistency on the yellow legal pad. I identified 4 separate areas where the financial disclosure was either demonstrably incomplete or directly contradicted by records I already held. I marked 3 clauses in the property division section that had been drafted in language deliberately designed to obscure the effective transfer of marital assets to entities that were technically outside the marital estate, but that would not withstand the scrutiny of a forensic accounting review. Then I made fresh coffee, sat back down, and wrote 3 pages of notes about what I was going to do about all of it. In the mediation room, Daniel Park set out the parameters of their position with the smooth efficiency of a man who has delivered this particular type of opening many times and has refined it to its most effective form. The lump sum settlement, $800,000. I did not react. The number was so far below the actual value of my equitable interest in the marital estate that reacting to it would have been like reacting to being offered $5 for a car. The correct response to an opening position that absurd is no reaction at all, because reaction tells the other side something about where your real number is. And I did not intend to tell Daniel Park anything he hadn't already found. The property division, the house in Wethersfield, 4 bedrooms, the blue kitchen Lily and I had chosen the paint for together, the garden she had planted the spring she turned 7, the oak tree in the backyard whose lower branch was exactly the right height for a child learning to climb, would be sold, with the proceeds distributed in a ratio that his language made sound equitable, and that, on examination, gave me approximately 30 cents on every dollar of equity I had helped build. The commercial properties acquired during the marriage, Richard had structured them carefully to appear as Whitmore Property Group business assets, but I had spent 8 months documenting the degree to which their acquisition had been funded by a combination of marital funds and revenue that had passed through the marital accounts, were not addressed in the settlement proposal at all. They were simply absent, as though they did not exist. The custody arrangement, joint physical custody on a schedule that gave Richard every other weekend and 1 weeknight per month, which would be, I noted without expression, approximately 3 times more contact with his daughter than he had voluntarily chosen in the past 2 years. I had the calendar records. I had the school attendance sheets. I had the pediatrician appointment logs. I had on my yellow legal pad a number, 9. The number of Lily's school or extracurricular events in the past 12 months that Richard had attended, and 41. The number he had not. Daniel presented all of this with the particular smoothness of someone who has learned that the packaging of information is as important as the information itself. He spoke about Richard's extraordinary commitment to Lily's well-being, and Richard's genuine desire for a clean and amicable resolution, and Richard's recognition of Victoria's contributions to the family. He used the word contributions 3 times. It is a word that means something specific in matrimonial law, and the way he used it suggested a very different thing from what it means, a thing I would be addressing in some detail in the weeks ahead. Eleanor, who had no legal standing in this mediation, and who was present solely because Richard had not been able to find a polite way to tell his mother that her attendance was counterproductive, or, more likely, had not tried, leaned forward slightly at one point and placed her fingertips on the edge of the table. "Victoria," she said. Her voice had the particular sweetness of a woman who has never had to ask for anything because everything has always been arranged. "I know this is an emotional time. Endings always are, but Richard truly has tried to be generous here, given—" a pause, exquisitely calibrated. "The circumstances. The circumstances. 11 years, a daughter, a home I had helped pay for and helped furnish and helped fill with the specific, unrepeatable texture of a life that two people build together whether they intend to or not. And the circumstances she was referring to were, I understood, the circumstances of my perceived dependence, my little practice, my part-time professional life, my decade of appearing to be a woman who had made herself smaller than she was in order to fit inside a space that someone else had decided was the right size." I looked at Eleanor. "I appreciate that," I said. I kept my voice warm. I had learned from my mother that warmth and steel are not mutually exclusive, that the most effective kindness is the kind that does not reveal, until it is too late to respond to, that it is also a weapon. "I really do." Then I looked at Gerald Foss. "Before we discuss the settlement terms in more detail," I said, "I'd like to raise a preliminary issue with the financial disclosure underlying this proposal. Specifically, several significant asset categories appear to have been omitted, and I'd like to understand whether that omission is intentional or an oversight before we go further." The room changed. It changed in the way rooms change when a conversation that has been proceeding according to one set of rules suddenly reveals that at least one participant has been operating according to a completely different set. The temperature didn't drop. That's a cliché. And the temperature in the room was controlled by a climate system that didn't care about what was happening in it. But something shifted. Something in the quality of the attention in the room became different. Daniel Park set his pen down. It was the smallest possible gesture, and it told me everything I needed to know about his internal state, because Daniel Park was not a man who set things down without intention. "I'm not sure what you mean by omissions," he said. "The disclosure was prepared by our forensic accounting team and reflects a comprehensive—" "It doesn't reflect the commercial property portfolio," I said. "Specifically, the 11 properties acquired during the marriage. Pages 47 through 61 of the disclosure list only the 4 properties that predate our marriage as Whitmore Property Group holdings. The others are simply absent from the asset schedule." I paused. "I've been a matrimonial attorney for 12 years, Daniel. I know what a comprehensive disclosure looks like. A silence of a different quality than the one at the beginning of the chapter." Richard had gone very still. Eleanor's hands, which had been folded in her characteristic composed arrangement, had tightened. Not dramatically, not in a way that anyone who hadn't spent 11 years learning to read her would notice. But I noticed it, the way the tendons in the backs of her hands shifted beneath the skin. "You have a legal background," Daniel said. Not a question. He was recalibrating. I could watch him doing it. He was a good enough attorney that the recalibration was fast and relatively invisible, but I was watching very carefully. "I do," I said. "I specialize in matrimonial and international asset litigation. I've spent the past 12 years helping clients identify precisely this kind of discrepancy in divorce proceedings." I opened the manila folder I had brought, not the full binder, which was for the courtroom. What I had brought today was 12 pages of carefully selected documents, enough to establish the contours of what I knew without revealing the full architecture of the case. "I have the financing documentation for the 11 properties here, along with the records showing the commingling of marital and business funds in their acquisition. I placed 3 pages on the table, face up, and slid them to the center. Daniel looked at them. He didn't reach for them immediately. He looked at them the way you look at something when you need to appear unsurprised while feeling the opposite of unsurprised. Richard looked at his mother. Eleanor looked at the pages on the table. Then she looked at me with an expression I had never seen from her in 11 years. Not the condescension, not the performative warmth, not the subtle assertion of hierarchy that had characterized every interaction we had ever had. This was something older and more honest than any of those things. It was wariness. Good, I thought. Finally, something real. I won't be signing the settlement documents today, I said. The sentence fell into the room like a stone into still water, cleanly, with the rings spreading outward from it in every direction. Richard leaned forward. Victoria. I'm not finished, I said. And something in my voice, not the volume, which didn't change, and not the sharpness, because there was no sharpness, just a quality of absolute steadiness, of a sentence spoken by someone who has already decided what she is going to say and is simply saying it and will not be redirected, stopped him. I had spent 11 years being interrupted. I was done with it. I won't be signing today because the proposed settlement is built on a financial disclosure that is materially incomplete, I said. I'd like to give both parties the opportunity to correct that before we proceed. If Mr. Park's team can provide a revised disclosure that includes all marital assets, the commercial properties, the associated financing structures, and any additional holdings that may have been omitted, I'm happy to reconvene within 2 weeks to discuss revised terms. I picked up my folder and my bag. Alternatively, we can proceed to the court process, which I'm also prepared for. Gerald Foss cleared his throat. He looked as though he wanted to say something and was not sure what the appropriate thing to say was. Perhaps we should schedule a follow-up session before... That won't be necessary today, I said. Gerald, thank you for the water and for hosting. I'll have my office follow up about scheduling. I looked at Daniel Park. I'll expect the revised disclosure by the end of the week. You don't have an office, Richard said. There was something in his voice, not quite contempt, but adjacent to it. The specific dismissal of a man who has convinced himself that his wife's professional life is a hobby, a thing she does to feel useful, a thing that has never quite risen to the level of actual consequential work. I have a practice, I said, which is a kind of office. You work from home part-time, Victoria. You're not... He stopped himself. But I heard the end of the sentence. He had stopped himself before saying it, but I heard it anyway, the way you hear things that have been said in 100 other forms over many years. You're not a real lawyer. You're not what you think you are. You're not someone who gets to sit on this side of this conversation. I looked at him. I'll show myself out, I said. I walked to the door, my hand on the handle, the frosted glass cool under my palm. We'll see you in court then, Daniel said. It was professionally done. No anger in it, just information. One professional to another. You will, I said. I turned back slightly, not quite enough to make eye contact, but enough that my voice would carry clearly. And Daniel, when you get back to your office, you should pull the Cayman Islands trust documentation from Richard's financial file. It's going to come up. I opened the door. I walked back down the hallway with the abstract prints in their muted, meaningless blues and greens. I pressed the elevator button. I rode down 14 floors. I walked through the marble lobby and through the revolving door and out onto the sidewalk where the March air was cold enough to make my eyes water, which I allowed for exactly as long as it took to walk to the parking garage 2 blocks east, and then I stopped allowing it. There was a great deal of work still to be done. My parents arrived in New Haven in August of 1981. They came with 2 suitcases between them, one large, one small, the large one belonging to my father and containing, in addition to his clothes, 3 textbooks from his engineering program at National Taiwan University, and a photograph of his parents taken outside their home in Taichung on the occasion of his father's 60th birthday. My mother's smaller suitcase contained her own clothes, a sewing kit, a small jade figure of Guanyin that had belonged to her grandmother, and a piece of paper with the address of a distant cousin who had arrived in New Haven 2 years earlier and had agreed, through a series of letters, to help them find an apartment. The distant cousin was a man named Henry, who worked in a restaurant and lived in a 1-bedroom apartment in the Fairhaven neighborhood with his wife and 2 young children. He had offered my parents the living room couch for the first 2 weeks. My mother has described this period of her life with a matter-of-factness that I have always found both characteristic and remarkable, as though the condition of those 2 weeks, the couch and the 1 bathroom and the borrowed dishes, was simply the starting condition, the given, the place from which you begin doing the actual work, not something to be dwelt on or grieved or mythologized. "We were there for 11 days, she told me once, when I was in law school and had called her in distress about a failed examination. Then we found the apartment on Shelton Avenue, 2nd floor, no elevator, 2 rooms. The heating was not reliable, but it was ours. My father's engineering degree from National Taiwan University was, in the American professional context of 1981, approximately as useful as a letter of recommendation from a person nobody had heard of. This was not because his engineering was inadequate. His engineering was exceptional. He had graduated in the top 5% of his program and had been told by his professors that he had genuine talent for structural analysis. The problem was credentialing. American firms did not recognize Taiwanese university degrees at par, and the professional engineering examination required for licensing in the United States was a different animal from the one he had already passed. He took a job as a draftsman at Connell & Associates, a mid-sized civil engineering firm on Chapel Street in New Haven. The job paid $15 an hour. His job title was Junior Drafting Technician. He sat at a drawing table for 8 hours a day and produced technical drawings from the specifications that the licensed engineers gave him, which is to say that he executed other people's designs with the steady, practiced hand of someone who understood those designs better than many of the people who had originated them. He did this for 7 years. I want to stay with this for a moment because it is important to the story I am telling, not as backstory, not as context, but as the thing itself. The thing that I am made of and that I carry in my bones and that has shaped, in ways I am still discovering, every decision I have ever made. 7 years. 7 years of arriving at the office on Chapel Street before 8 in the morning and leaving after 5 in the afternoon, and going home to the apartment on Shelton Avenue where my mother was bent over the kitchen table with her sewing kit, taking in alterations for the neighbors and later for a small tailoring shop on Wally Avenue that paid her by the piece. 7 years of watching the engineers above him, men who were, in several documented cases, less skilled than he was, who made mistakes he could see coming and was not in a position to prevent, submit work under their licenses that he had substantially contributed to. 7 years of sitting in the break room during lunch with a sandwich my mother had packed and a copy of Engineering Practice and Ethics or Structural Analysis, Principles and Applications propped open beside it, studying for an examination that he would need to take in a language that was not his first. He took the professional engineering examination for the first time in 1985. He failed by a margin of 4 points. He told me this story when I was 23, in my second year at Yale Law School, on a night when I had called him from my apartment at midnight in tears after what I had then considered the most humiliating professional failure of my life, a moot court argument that I had been certain I was prepared for and that had collapsed, mid-argument, when opposing counsel raised a procedural point I had overlooked, and the faculty judge had looked at me over his reading glasses with an expression of patient disappointment that I had found, in that moment, annihilating. My father had answered the phone on the second ring. He had listened to me cry for approximately 3 minutes without saying anything. My father's silence is always active, always listening, never the silence of someone waiting for you to finish so he can speak. Then he said, "Tell me what happened." I told him. He listened. Then he told me about the engineering examination, the first attempt, the 4-point failure, the way he had driven home from the testing center in Bridgeport and sat in the parking lot of the apartment building on Shelton Avenue for 20 minutes before going inside, not because he was ashamed, though he was, in the complex, private way of someone who measures themselves by an internal standard that other people cannot see, but because he was performing a calculation. I sat in that parking lot, he told me, and I added up the time. I thought about what it had taken to get to that examination. I thought about your mother at the kitchen table at 10 o'clock at night with her sewing, and I thought, this is not enough time. I need more time. I need to go back and I need to study differently, and in 2 years, I will take it again. He took it again in 1987. He passed with a score in the 92nd percentile nationwide. You failed the argument tonight, he said, on the phone at midnight when I was 23. That is not the same thing as failing. I keep this sentence somewhere inside me. I have taken it out and looked at it many times in my life. I took it out in the parking garage of the Sovereign Building on the morning after the mediation session, sitting in my car with the engine off, the gray light filtering down through the concrete levels above, and I held it for a moment. I had not failed the argument. I had not yet made it. My mother's name is Linda, which is not her given name. Her given name is Li Hua, which is a name that American mouths found difficult in the early 1980s, and which she had translated into its approximate English equivalent for professional purposes with the pragmatic efficiency she brings to all problems. She has never seemed to mind the translation. When I was young, I sometimes minded it for her, in the way you mind things for the people you love, when you are old enough to understand what has been given up and young enough to still believe that what is given up should be mourned. Names are not the thing, she told me once, when I was perhaps 12 and had asked her about it with the adolescent intensity of someone who has recently become aware of injustice and wants to know what to do with the awareness. The thing is, what you do. Names are just what other people use to find you. She ran her alterations business from the apartment kitchen table until I was 5, and then from a small space she rented in the back of a dry cleaner's shop on Wally Avenue. And then, when I was in high school, from a storefront she leased herself on Edgewood Avenue, 300 square feet with a single window and a sign she had painted herself. Linda's Alterations. She hired one part-time employee, a Dominican woman named Rosa, who became, over the years, one of her closest friends. She kept the books herself, in a ledger that she maintained with the same meticulous care she brought to every seam. I grew up in the specific geography of those two businesses, my father's engineering office and my mother's alterations shop, in the way that children grow up in the particular atmosphere of their parents' work, absorbing without being taught the textures and rhythms of how a life is made. I understood, before I understood it consciously, that the things my parents had were things they had built with their hands and their minds over a long, patient time, and that they had built them in a place that was not designed to make it easy for people like them, and that they had built them anyway. My father's one rule, the only explicit professional directive he ever gave me. In this country, the law protects those who understand it. Learn the law, Victoria. He said this to me when I was 8 years old, after an incident I no longer remember the specifics of, something involving a neighbor and a lease dispute, I think. The details have blurred over time, during which he had tried to navigate a legal situation without the resources to hire an attorney, and had ended up, through a combination of careful reading and my mother's insistence that they could figure it out themselves, arriving at an outcome that was acceptable but that he felt, with the precision of an engineer, could have been better if he had known more. Learn the law, he said, not because you should become a lawyer, because knowing the law means knowing what people can and cannot do to you. Knowing the law means you cannot be told things that are not true about what you are owed or what you owe. Knowing the law is how you stay free. I thought about this in a different way after what happened with Richard. I thought about how it was not only the law, but the specific law, matrimonial law, asset law, the law of what belongs to whom and how it can be hidden and how it can be found. That had made the difference. And I thought about how many women in situations similar to mine did not have that specific knowledge, did not have the 12 years of professional experience, did not have the tools to look at a proposed settlement and understand immediately what it was leaving out and how to find the evidence of what was missing. This is something I think about now, from the other side of everything that happened. I think about it more than I thought I would. I was the first person in my family to attend university in the United States. I was the first to attend law school. I sat in the lectures halls of Yale Law School with a focus that my classmates sometimes mistook for ambition. What it actually was is something I have had to think about carefully to describe accurately. It was not ambition, exactly, though ambition was certainly there. It was something more fundamental, a sense of obligation that ran in two directions at once. Backward, toward my parents at the kitchen table and the apartment on Shelton Avenue and the 7 years of drawing tables and 12 o'clock exam preparations. And forward toward the future self I was trying to build. Who would be worthy of what had been spent to get her there? I studied the way my father had studied for the engineering examination. Not frantically, not in the compressed sprints of someone who was trying to close a gap at the last minute, but with the sustained, patient intensity of someone who understands that deep knowledge is the only kind that holds up under pressure. I went to every lecture. I read every assignment. I found the connections between cases, the threads that linked one precedent to another, the way the law was not a collection of separate rules, but a living architecture with its own internal logic that, once you understood it at the structural level, you could navigate with a confidence that the people who had only memorized the surface rules could not quite match. I graduated third in my class, which was not first, and which bothered me for approximately 2 weeks before I directed the energy I had been spending on bothering myself toward the next thing. The next thing was Harrington and Cole LLP in Boston, one of the oldest and most respected family law firms in New England, where I was hired as a first-year associate and given the kind of work that first-year associates are given: discovery review, research memos, the preparation of documents that senior attorneys would argue in proceedings where I was not yet permitted to speak. I did this work with the same focused intensity I had brought to law school, and for the same reason, because the work was building something, even when the work itself felt small. Because the person who spent 300 hours reviewing discovery documents for a complex asset concealment case in the first year of her career was the person who, 12 years later, knew exactly how asset concealment cases were built and how they were dismantled and where the points of vulnerability were in any given structure. I became, without planning to become it, one of the foremost specialists in matrimonial asset litigation in New England. I handled 63 high-net-worth divorce cases, the majority involving some form of offshore or domestic asset concealment. I became the person that other attorneys called when they had a case that involved financial structures complex enough that they needed someone who spoke both law and accounting fluently, who could read a corporate filing and a wire transfer record simultaneously and understand what they said to each other. I was good at my job in the specific way that means people who were not good at their jobs could not see how I was doing what I was doing while I was doing it. Richard Whitmore could not see it. He never looked. I met Richard Whitmore at a real estate and legal conference in Boston in September of 2012. The conference was held at the Copley Plaza Hotel, a venue that announces its own grandeur with the practiced assurance of an institution that has been doing this for over a century and finds the effort of impressing people frankly tedious. The conference was titled something like Navigating Complex Asset Structures in High-Value Real Estate Transactions, and it was attended by approximately 300 lawyers, financiers, developers, and the various affiliated professionals who exist in the ecosystem of high-value real estate: accountants, insurers, consultants, the specific subspecies of banker who specializes in the kind of transaction that requires a conference room and a signed NDA just to discuss the parameters. I was there to present a paper on the intersections of matrimonial and commercial property law, specifically the way that the increasingly common practice of holding personal real estate in corporate structures was creating complications in divorce proceedings, complications that the courts were just beginning to develop consistent approaches to addressing. It was the kind of paper that is genuinely interesting to approximately 40 of the 300 people at any given conference, and I had arranged to present it in one of the smaller breakout rooms, which meant that the 40 people who found it interesting could find it, and the 260 people who would not be could remain comfortably in the main ballroom listening to something about tax-deferred exchanges. I had been at Harrington and Cole for 4 years at this point, and had recently been invited to consider partnership, which was a decision I was still thinking through with the careful deliberation I brought to decisions of any significance. I was 24 years old. I was, in the specific way of someone who is good at what they do and knows it, and is not yet entirely comfortable with the knowledge, a person who was still learning to occupy the space her ability had made room for. The conference reception was held the first evening in the main ballroom, which was the kind of room that had been built when rooms like this were meant to make a statement about the permanence of certain kinds of wealth: high ceilings, crystal chandeliers, the murmur of several hundred conversations happening simultaneously, creating a specific ambient frequency that is the sound of professional proximity without necessarily intimacy. I was standing near the window. I habitually find the edges of rooms at events like this, not because I am shy, but because the edge gives you the full view, the ability to see the whole room at once, rather than only what is immediately in front of you, reviewing the conference program and calculating how much of the reception I was obligated to attend before it became acceptable to go back to my room and prepare for tomorrow's presentation. "You're the most focused person here," said a voice beside me. "You haven't looked away from that program in about 5 minutes. I looked up. Richard Whitmore was, at 31, the kind of man that rooms rearrange themselves around without his having to do anything to encourage it. He was tall, 6'2", an inch or two taller than I would have said before I measured it, which I eventually did because I am the kind of person who verifies estimates. With dark hair cut short and the kind of jaw that women's magazine editors would describe as strong, which is not a useful description, but is apparently an accurate one. He was wearing a suit that was expensive without being ostentatious, which is itself a kind of sophistication, the ability to wear money in a way that whispers rather than shouts. But what I noticed first was not the jaw or the suit or the physical arrangement of his features. What I noticed first was that he was looking at me with the specific quality of attention of someone who is genuinely curious, as opposed to the quality of attention, which I had encountered enough times by then to recognize, of someone who is going through the motions of appearing curious while actually waiting to say what they came over to say. "It is interesting," I said. "The program." He smiled. "Real estate financing law is interesting to you. Everything is interesting if you pay enough attention." A beat. He seemed to be genuinely considering this. "That sounds like something you actually believe." "It is," I said. "Richard Whitmore," he said, extending his hand. "Victoria Huang," I said, taking it. "I haven't added the Ashford yet," I almost said, and then caught myself, because that was a strange thing to say to a stranger. And I have since thought about that near miss with a particular quality of attention, the way my brain, at 24, in the first seconds of meeting this man, had produced the end of my own future name. We talked for 40 minutes. He was the head. He would have said he ran, because the distinction mattered to him, of Whitmore Property Group, the family real estate development company that his father had founded in 1978, and that he had taken over operational control of at 26, when his father's health had begun to decline. He had grown the company's commercial portfolio by 60% in 5 years. He was interested in the legal questions around complex ownership structures, the subject of my presentation the next morning. Not in the abstract way of someone who finds the topic conceptually interesting, but in the specific way of someone who has encountered the problem in practice and is trying to understand how to think about it. He asked good questions, specific questions, the kind that revealed that he had actually been listening to what I said before asking them. He didn't interrupt. He laughed at things that were actually funny rather than at things that were just adjacent to humor, which is a quality I have always found disproportionately appealing in people. When I finally said that I needed to go prepare for my presentation, he said, "Can I take you to dinner after your session tomorrow? I'd like to hear more about the matrimonial angle." "Most people don't ask for more of the matrimonial angle," I said. "Most people haven't been trying to figure out how to structure their business interests so that they don't become complicated in the event of a divorce," he said. "Assuming I eventually get married, which I've been told I should do something about." "And who's telling you that?" "My mother," he said, with some regularity. I said yes to the dinner. I said yes because he was interesting, and because the dinner turned into another dinner and another, and because there was something in his certainty, in the way he occupied rooms, in the easy confidence with which he moved through a world that had been arranged, from the beginning, to accommodate men like him, that felt, at 24, and new to Boston, and still figuring out how to carry what I had earned, like shelter. I know better now what that certainty actually was, what it had been built on, and what it required of the people around it to sustain. But that knowledge came slowly, over years, through the accumulation of small evidence that I should perhaps have assembled into its conclusions earlier than I did. I am not hard on myself about this. People are not puzzles you solve in an afternoon. They are processes that reveal themselves over time, and the revelation is almost always slower than you wish it had been after the fact. We married in June of 2014. The early years were good. I want to say this clearly and without qualification, because the story I am telling is not a story in which a woman realizes she was wrong from the beginning, that she missed obvious signs, that she was foolish. The early years of my marriage to Richard Whitmore were genuinely good in the ways that matter. We were interested in each other. We made each other laugh. We argued sometimes, and resolved the arguments, and both usually emerged from them having understood something we hadn't understood before. He was generous with his time and his attention in those years, or at least he was when he was present, which was not always. Richard's professional life was demanding in the specific way of someone who had built his identity entirely around the building of something, and who had not yet learned to distinguish between the building and the self. We bought a house in Wethersfield in the summer of 2014. Richard chose it, which was a pattern that established itself early, and that I accommodated because I was still establishing my practice and had less bandwidth to dedicate to decisions that felt, at the time, like they could be revisited. A 4-bedroom colonial on a quiet street with oak trees and a sidewalk and a backyard that was larger than anything I had grown up with. The house was too large for 2 people, which Richard said with satisfaction and I noted with ambivalence, though I kept the ambivalence to myself. Eleanor was involved in the house selection to a degree that I registered and did not comment on, because I had already understood, in the year since meeting her, that Eleanor's involvement in her son's decisions was a condition of those decisions rather than an addition to them. She had opinions about the kitchen cabinets and the front door color and the neighborhood's proximity to the country club, and her opinions were offered as information rather than preference, which meant that disagreeing with them required explaining not just what you wanted, but why the thing you wanted was something other than the obvious wrong choice. I was not, in those years, interested in that expenditure of energy. I had other things to spend it on. Lily was born in April of 2015. There are things that happen in a life that change the nature of the life in ways you can't fully understand until you're standing on the other side of them. I had been told, in the abstract, that having a child would change me. I had understood this information intellectually, the way you understand information about places you haven't been yet. The reality was different from the understanding in the way that all important things are different from their descriptions. Lily came into the world on an April afternoon when the light through the hospital window was the specific soft gold of early spring, and the nurse placed her in my arms, and she opened her eyes, enormous dark eyes, the eyes of someone who has arrived in a new place and is immediately taking inventory, and looked at me with a focus so direct and complete that I remember thinking, with absolute clarity, "This is the most important thing I will ever do. Everything else is in service of this." She is 9 years old now. She is every day, still, the clearest thing that has ever happened to me. Richard's erosion of me was so gradual that I did not have a name for it for a long time. This is important to understand, because the version of this story that is easiest to tell, and perhaps easiest to hear, is the version in which there are clear villains and clear victims, and clear moments at which, if only the victim had been paying enough attention, she might have recognized what was happening and changed course. I have told you that I am always paying attention, and I was. But paying attention to a process that is deliberately designed to be invisible is different from paying attention to a thing that presents itself openly, and the specific genius of the slow erosion, of the marriage that dismantles itself piece by piece over years rather than breaking all at once, is that by the time the pattern becomes visible, so much of the structure has already been taken apart. It began, as these things often do, with something that looked like consideration. We were in our 3rd year of marriage, and I was managing a complex case that was in its pre-trial phase, which meant I was working 12-hour days and taking calls at 11 at night and spending my weekends in a state of focused, productive distraction that was not compatible with the domestic life Richard had, I understood later, been forming expectations about. The case resolved in April, and in the quiet that followed, Richard suggested that I might want to consider scaling back my practice. Not permanently, he was careful to say. Just for now. Just while Lily was young and needed more of my presence. Just because the work I was doing was clearly stressful, and wasn't it stressful? Didn't I want to rest? Didn't the family deserve a little more of me than it was getting? He framed it as a gift he was offering me, the gift of time, of being present, of releasing me from the professional pressure that was, as he saw it, taking something from our family that should have belonged to our family. I want to be honest. There was a part of me that was relieved by the suggestion. The case had been hard. I was tired. The idea of stepping back, of being more present, of giving something more of myself to Lily, and to the house, and to the life we were building. This was not unappealing. Ambition and exhaustion coexist in people, and in that particular April, I had more of the latter than I usually allowed myself to acknowledge. I reduced my caseload. I moved my practice to a home office. I continued to take cases. I never stopped entirely, because I could not stop entirely, because my work was not separate from who I was in the way that Richard imagined it was. But I structured my professional life around Lily's schedule, around Richard's schedule, around the rhythm of the household in a way I had not before. It looked from the outside like a choice, and in the most technical sense it was. But it was a choice made in a context that Richard had shaped without my fully understanding that he was shaping it. A context in which my exhaustion was strategic, in which the suggestion came at the moment most likely to be accepted, in which the framing of the gift obscured the nature of the transaction. In exchange for the gift of time, I gave up the professional standing that would have made me more difficult to dismiss. In exchange for the gift of presence, I gave up the income level that would have made me financially independent in a way that Richard could not easily manage around. In exchange for the gift of rest, I gave up the visibility that would have made it harder for people, for Eleanor, for Richard's colleagues, for the mediator at Harrington Mediation Associates, to refer to my professional life as a little practice. I did not understand the full shape of the transaction for years, but I was keeping notes. The specific moments of erosion are important to document because they were, individually, so small. The first I want to tell you about happened at a dinner party in the winter of our 4th year of marriage, a dinner at the home of one of Richard's business partners, a man named Charles Voss, who had made his money in commercial lending and who kept a house in Avon that functioned primarily as a staging ground for the performance of having made money in commercial lending. There were 12 of us at the table. The conversation turned, as it often did in those rooms, to a legal question, specifically a recent Connecticut Supreme Court ruling about the right of spouses to access business financial records during divorce proceedings. I knew the ruling. I had followed it closely because it had implications for 2 of my active cases. I began to explain it, the specific holding, the way it had developed the existing case law, the practical implications for how financial disclosure would be structured in matrimonial proceedings going forward. Richard talked over me. He did it smoothly, without appearing to notice that he was doing it. The specific skill of the practiced interrupter, the person who has spent so long assuming the conversational floor is theirs that the assumption has become invisible. He repeated what I had just said, approximately, in slightly less precise language, and added a comment of his own, and the conversation moved forward, as though I had not spoken. I registered this. I made a note of it internally, in the meticulous ledger I keep of things that have happened. And then I said nothing, because it was a dinner party. And I had decided, in that moment, that correcting the record was not worth the cost of the social friction, and because, and this is the part that I have thought about most carefully in the years since, I had already begun to understand that Richard needed to be the most informed person in any room he was in, and that the cost of challenging that need was a discomfort that would spread beyond the moment of challenge and into the days that followed it. It was cheaper, in the short term, to let it go. The problem with short-term economy is that it compounds. The canceled database subscription came later that year. The legal database, a comprehensive resource I used for research on complex asset cases, was expensive, as such things are, and Richard had taken over managing the household finances with the thoroughness of someone who had been waiting to do so. He replaced it with a cheaper, less comprehensive alternative, framing it as a household budget decision. I did not argue because it was, technically, not necessary for my scaled-back practice, and arguing felt disproportionate to the stakes. I found workarounds. I maintained my access to the Yale Law Library remotely, which is a privilege of alumni in good standing. I built relationships with law librarians who were, without exception, the most underappreciated people in the legal profession. I continued to find what I needed, because I am the kind of person who finds what she needs. But the cancellation was not, I understood later, primarily about the money. It was about making me smaller in a way that I would not notice until I was already smaller. Eleanor's comments were their own category. The observation, at a Thanksgiving dinner in our 5th year of marriage, that it was so wonderful that Victoria was able to prioritize family. The suggestion, offered over brunch in our 7th year, that perhaps Lily would benefit from a full-time mother rather than splitting her attention between 2 places. The question, asked with genuine warmth and no visible irony, of whether I found my little projects fulfilling, and whether I needed help thinking about what the next chapter might look like for me professionally. I maintained my warm, pleasant, revealing nothing expression through every one of these conversations. I filed them in the ledger. I said, "Thank you, Eleanor. I'm very happy with how things are going." And I meant it. And I also meant something that Eleanor could not hear in those words, which was, "I see exactly what you are doing, and I will remember it." The first sign appeared in the tax returns. It was a Tuesday in April. Lily was at school. Richard was in Miami for a 3-day meeting. The house was quiet in the way that it was only quiet when I was in it alone, which is a different quality of quiet from the quiet of an empty house. I was at the kitchen table with a second cup of coffee, and the folder of documents our accountant had sent over for review and signature, the annual joint tax filing that I had always reviewed before signing because I am a lawyer and that is what lawyers do. The Meridian deduction was on page 12 of the supporting schedules. $480,000 listed under professional services, consulting with the payee identified as Meridian Advisory LLC, Delaware. I read it twice. Then I set the tax documents to the side, opened my laptop, and navigated to the Delaware Division of Corporations Public Search Portal. Meridian Advisory LLC. Registered 14 months prior to the tax year in question. Registered agent. A company called First State Corporate Services, which is one of the approximately 200 corporate formation services in Delaware that will register a company for you, act as your registered agent, and maintain your statutory presence in the state, all without ever asking what the company actually does or who actually controls it. The registered agent was a dead end for names. But I was not looking for names. I opened a second window and pulled up the banking records for our joint accounts, which I still had access to as a joint account holder. I searched the transaction history for payments to Meridian Advisory LLC. Found them. Monthly transfers, regular as a heartbeat, the first one dating back 26 months. I added them up. Total payments to Meridian over 26 months. $3,120,000. I sat with this number for a moment. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, a car went by on the street. The refrigerator made its sound. $3,120,000, paid to a Delaware shell company with no documented employees, no verifiable deliverables, no professional presence of any kind, at a rate of approximately $120,000 per month. I opened a new document on my laptop. I titled it M. I began to write. The investigation took 8 months. I conducted it with the discipline of someone who has run enough of these investigations professionally to know that the two things that destroy them are haste and emotion. Haste makes you reach conclusions before the evidence supports them, and then fail to notice when the evidence contradicts them. Emotion makes you overreach, makes you want the conclusion so badly that you start to see it in things that only look like evidence if you're already looking for it. I felt no haste and I felt no lack of emotion. I felt all of the emotion, the specific layered grief of a woman understanding that the life she has been living has been built on a foundation that is not what she believed it was, that the person she trusted has been systematically deceiving her in ways that required sustained effort and active concealment, that the years in which she made herself smaller were years in which she was not, in fact, in a genuine partnership but in a managed arrangement designed to serve someone else's interests. I felt all of that. I set it aside every morning when I sat down at my laptop and opened document M and kept working. I traced the Meridian payments through the Delaware corporate structure to the registered agent, and from the registered agent to the employer identification number filed with the IRS, which I accessed through a professional database service that my practice had maintained a subscription to. The EIN filing listed a name as the responsible party, Marcus Webb of Lyme, Connecticut. I knew Marcus Webb. I had known him for 9 years, since the first dinner party Richard had taken me to as his girlfriend, at which Marcus had drunk too much Burgundy and told a story about a sailing accident in the Bahamas that I had filed away automatically, as the story of a person who is more comfortable with the performance of adventure than with adventure itself. He was Richard's oldest friend from Dartmouth. He had the soft edges of a man who has been well patted against consequence for most of his life and who does not entirely know it. He had signed as nominal director of Meridian. I added his name to document M. The Cayman account took longer. The Cayman Islands are, as a financial jurisdiction, specifically designed to resist the kind of investigation I was conducting. The combination of strict banking secrecy laws, the absence of tax information exchange agreements with most jurisdictions, and the specific corporate structures available in the Cayman Islands make it the destination of choice for people with money they want to make very difficult to find. But Cayman accounts do not exist in isolation. They are fed by domestic transfers, which leave domestic records, and those domestic records exist in a regulatory framework that requires more documentation than the Cayman end of the chain. I followed the Meridian payments. I followed them through the Delaware entity to the correspondent banking network. I found the outbound wire transfers leaving the Meridian-linked account. I found the routing numbers they traveled through. I found the receiving institution, a private banking entity in Georgetown, Grand Cayman, that specialized in trust services for high-net-worth individuals. I found the trust name. I found the trust documentation, which was accessible through the Cayman Islands Corporate Registry to anyone with the correct professional credentials and the knowledge of where to look. I found the name of the sole beneficiary, Richard James Whitmore. I sat back in my chair. The apartment was very quiet. Lily was asleep. It was 11:40 at night, and I had been sitting at my laptop since 9:30, and my back ached, and my eyes were dry. I wrote the number in document M, the total in the Cayman Trust account, based on the accumulated transfers minus estimated fees and currency conversion, approximately $2,800,000, growing, at the rate of the monthly transfers, by approximately $80,000 per month. I closed the laptop. I went to check on Lily, who was asleep on her side with her hair spread across the pillow, and her mouth slightly open, and Duke, the dog my parents had bought for Lily's 7th birthday, who had been staying with us that week while my parents were visiting my father's sister in New Haven, curled at the foot of her bed. I stood in the doorway for a long time. Then I went to bed and lay in the dark listening to Richard breathe beside me and thought about my father sitting in the parking lot of the apartment building on Shelton Avenue after failing the engineering examination by 4 points. I thought about what it means to know what you need to know and to sit with that knowledge and to let it be fuel rather than fire. 4 months later, I found Marcus Webb's role documented in the Delaware Incorporation filing. 3 months after that, I found the rental agreement for Serena Collins's Back Bay apartment in the pocket of Richard's winter coat. 8 months after I opened document M, I had 312 pages of evidence and a complete picture of the financial architecture Richard had spent 3 years building. I had also, in those 8 months, made one other preparation that would matter. I had reopened my relationship with my former firm, Harrington and Cole, in the specific capacity of independent consultant, not as a practicing attorney of record, but as a subject matter expert whom the firm retained for complex asset matters. This arrangement, which I had structured carefully and documented thoroughly, had generated income over the past 18 months that I had not mentioned to Richard, and that I had deposited into a personal account he did not know existed. It was not deception. It was insurance. And it was, as it turned out, exactly enough. Richard told me he wanted a divorce on a Tuesday in February. He came home from a 3-day trip to Miami. The same Miami trip during which, I had documented, he had spent 2 evenings with Serena Collins at a restaurant in South Beach, where the average entree costs $62, carrying a dozen red roses and the careful expression of a man who has rehearsed a speech and is concentrating on delivering it as written. The roses were a calculated error. Richard had bought me roses twice in our marriage, once on our 2nd anniversary, which was genuine, and once after an argument in our 6th year in which he had said something I had not forgiven him for saying, which was also genuine in its way. A 3rd bouquet of roses on a random Tuesday in February, in the context of everything else I knew, was not a gift. It was staging. He put them in the vase on the kitchen counter himself. He knew where the vase was, had always known, had simply chosen not to use that knowledge for the decade of our marriage, during which the roses were, presumably, not required for narrative purposes. He filled the vase with water. He arranged the flowers. He turned around. "Victoria," he said, "can we sit down?" Lily was at Sophie's that evening, a standing Tuesday arrangement that had been established 6 months earlier and that I had established not for this occasion, I had not known, 6 months ago, the specific date, but for the general occasion, which I had known, with the accumulated certainty of someone who has been reading the evidence for a long time, was coming. We sat down. Richard delivered his speech. It was, on its own terms, a well-constructed speech. It expressed regret without specificity, the good divorce attorney's advice. Don't enumerate the ways the marriage failed, because every enumeration creates a counter-narrative. It positioned the divorce as a mutual conclusion rather than a unilateral decision. Also good advice. We've grown apart, rather than, I want to leave. It emphasized his desire for Lily's well-being and for a respectful, adult process. He said, I want this to be as painless as possible for both of us. He said, I hope we can always be co-parents in the truest sense. He did not mention Serena Collins. When he finished, I was quiet for a moment. I was noting, in the internal ledger, the specific words he had used and the specific words he had not used. I was also doing something more personal, which I will tell you honestly. I was allowing myself, in the privacy of my own chest, to feel the weight of it. Not the shock. I had known this was coming. But the specific gravity of a thing being confirmed that you have known for a long time but have not yet named aloud. There is a difference between suspecting that a marriage is over and sitting across the kitchen table from the person you married while he tells you that it is, and the difference is real and not easily described. I let the weight exist. I allowed it exactly as much space as it needed. Then I returned to the surface. I understand, I said. Richard looked at me with the careful attention of someone who is prepared for a particular response and has not received it. I know this is. Would you like tea? I said. A pause. I'm sorry? Tea. Would you like some? I was going to make a cup. He looked at me with the expression of a man encountering a situation for which his preparation has not accounted. Yes. Sure. I made tea. We sat across the table and drank it, and he told me about his attorney, Daniel Park, whom he named with the careful casualness of someone who has rehearsed the naming, and about the mediation process he hoped we could pursue, and about the settlement framework his attorney was putting together, which would be fair, he assured me, very fair. I listened and asked occasional questions that moved the conversation forward without revealing anything about my own position. When he went to bed that night, I watched him go with the specific quality of attention that had, over the past 8 months, become my primary mode of engaging with him. I sat at the kitchen table for another hour. I made a list. It was not an emotional list, not a list of grievances or losses or things I was angry about. It was a practical list of the next steps in a process that was now officially underway. Then I called my mother. It was tonight, I said when she answered. A pause. My mother's pause contains more information than most people's sentences. Are you hurt? She asked. This is an interesting question. No, I said. I'm not hurt. I'm clear. Is that strange? No, she said. That is you. She was right. Clarity is how I feel most emotions that are big enough to matter, not in the moment of the emotion itself, which I have learned to let exist in its own space, but in the hours after it, when what remains is the clean, stripped-down knowledge of what has happened and what needs to happen next. It is a personality trait that has been variously described as strength, coldness, and professionalism depending on who is describing it and under what circumstances. Come home this weekend, my mother said. Bring Lily. Your father will make the dumplings she likes. Mom. Eat first, she said. You can fight better when you've been fed. We went home that weekend. My father made pork and cabbage dumplings, and Lily arranged them on the plate in a specific pattern that apparently represented a galaxy. My parents' kitchen smelled of sesame oil and ginger. The table was too small for 4 people, and had always been too small for 4 people, and we sat at it anyway, elbows touching, and ate. I drove back on Sunday evening with the container of frozen dumplings on the passenger seat, and the specific steadiness in my chest that being in that kitchen always produces in me. Not the steadiness of someone who is not afraid, but the steadiness of someone who has been reminded of what she is made of and finds it sufficient. My closest friend is a woman named Sophie Beaumont. She is 34 years old, which makes her a year younger than me. She was born in Montreal to a French-Canadian father and a Haitian mother, and she grew up between 2 languages and 2 temperaments, and emerged from the combination as someone who is constitutionally incapable of performing an emotion she is not feeling. This makes her occasionally difficult at dinner parties and indispensable in a crisis. She came to us when Lily was 2, referred by a neighbor whose children she had cared for 3 years, and about whom she spoke with the professional warmth of someone who genuinely likes children in the specific individual sense, not the generalized abstract sense of someone who has decided that liking children is an important part of her professional identity. She has an early childhood education degree and reads 2 books a week, and once told me, in a conversation about parenting, that the most important thing you can teach a child is that their feelings are real and that they are survivable. She is the only person I told about Document M before the mediation session. I told her on a Saturday in November, 4 months before Richard told me he wanted a divorce, because I had reached the point in the investigation where what I knew was complete enough to be shared, and the weight of carrying it alone had begun to feel like a physical thing. I told her, because I trust her with the kind of trust that is not the trust of habit or proximity, but the trust of having been witnessed over time by someone who sees you clearly and chooses to stay. Sophie listened to everything without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "How long have you known?" 7 months, I said, "and you didn't tell me." I needed to be sure first. A silence. Then, "How are you?" I stopped, started again. "I know what needs to happen. I'm less sure about the other part." "What other part?" "The part where this is my marriage," I said. "The part where I was wrong about who I was married to. The part where Lily's going to lose, not her father exactly, but the version of him she thinks exists." Sophie put her hand over mine. She didn't say anything, which was the right thing to do, because there was nothing to say about that part. The only response to it was what she was offering. The full, quiet, uninterrupted acknowledgement that the thing I was saying was real and hard, and was going to continue to be hard for a long time. After a while, she said, "What do you need from me?" "I need you to help me practice the cross-examination," I said. "I'm going to represent myself." She was quiet for a moment. Then, slowly, she began to smile. Not the smile of someone who is reassured, but the smile of someone who has recognized something. "Of course you are," she said. "All right. When do we start?" We started the next week. Sophie was, it turned out, a disconcertingly effective stand-in for Daniel Park. She had the instincts of someone who understood narrative and who could identify the weakest points in an argument and press on them with patient precision. We worked for 2 hours every Saturday for 6 weeks. I was cross-examined, challenged, redirected, and accused of fabrication more times than I can count. And by the end of the 6 weeks, there was not a question Daniel Park asked me in the courtroom that I had not already answered, under pressure, in Sophie's living room. The night after I filed the divorce petition and the evidence disclosure, I called Sophie from the parking lot of the courthouse. "It's filed," I said. "How do you feel?" "Like I'm at the beginning of something," I said. "Which I am." "Yes," she said. "But you've been at the beginning of it for 8 months. The rest is just the part where other people find out." I filed on a Thursday morning in the 3rd week of March. The Hartford Family Court opens its filing window at 8:30. I was there at 8:15, standing on the courthouse steps in a gray wool coat with my leather briefcase in one hand and a thermos of coffee in the other, watching the city begin its morning in the particular unhurried way of a Thursday. Not the frantic sprint of Monday, not the resigned slog of Wednesday, just a Thursday, a day that has no mythology attached to it, a day that is simply the day things get done. The clerk who processed my filing was a woman in her 50s named Donna, according to her nameplate, who had the practiced efficiency of someone who has processed 10,000 filings and has long since stopped being surprised by any of them. She flipped through the 312-page binder with the speed of someone doing a page count rather than reading, confirmed the document tabs and exhibit numbers, stamped everything that needed to be stamped, and handed me my copies with a receipt. "Have a good day," she said. "Thank you," I said. "You too." I walked back out into the March morning and stood on the courthouse steps and drank my coffee. The sky was the same pewter gray it had been on the morning of the mediation session, which felt appropriate, as though the sky had decided to be consistent about this particular chapter of my life. I thought about Lily at school right now, in her classroom with the blue cubbies and the reading corner with the beanbag chairs, doing whatever 9-year-olds do on Thursday mornings. I thought about my father at his kitchen table in New Haven with his own coffee, reading the engineering journal he subscribed to and had subscribed to for 40 years. I thought about my mother at the alterations shop on Edgewood Avenue, the morning light coming through the single window, the sound of her machine. I finished my coffee. I went back to the apartment. I had 3 client calls that morning and a brief to finish by 4 o'clock. And the world did not stop for the fact that I had just filed for divorce and submitted 300 pages of evidence of my husband's financial crimes to the Hartford Family Court. The world very rarely stops. This is something you either make peace with or spend your life resenting, and I made peace with it a long time ago. Daniel Park's office called at 4:17 that afternoon. I was at my desk finishing the brief when my phone lit up with the number. I had expected the call. I had known, from the moment I included the Meridian documentation in the disclosure, that the call would come within 24 hours, but I had not expected it quite this quickly, which told me something about the degree of alarm the filing had produced. "Ms. Huang Ashford," Daniel said when I answered. His voice was controlled in the specific way of someone who is controlling it deliberately, which is different from someone who is simply calm. "I've had the opportunity to review your filing." "Good," I said. "I hope it was useful." A pause. "I think we should meet." "I think the courtroom will be more efficient," I said. "My client is prepared to significantly revise the settlement framework," he said, "in light of the additional documentation you've provided. I think there's a path to a resolution that works for both parties without." "Daniel," I said. I set my pen down. I was not unkind. Daniel Park had been doing his job, and his job had, until this morning, been based on a set of facts that his client had deliberately withheld from him. He was not the villain of this story. He was a man who had been used as a tool by someone who was. The time for settlement discussions was before the financial disclosure was falsified. I'm happy to appear in court and let Judge Osei review the evidence. If Richard wants to avoid the federal implications of what's in that binder, the conversation he needs to have is not with me. It's with his accountant and his criminal defense attorney. A longer pause. "I see," Daniel said. "I'll see you in court," I said. I kept my voice neutral. "Have a good evening." I hung up and sat for a moment with my hand on the phone. Then I picked up my pen and finished the brief. Eleanor's response was more personal and, in its way, more revealing. She called me 2 days after the filing on a Saturday morning when Lily was at a friend's birthday party, and I was in my home office reviewing case law on the admissibility of foreign financial documents in Connecticut family court proceedings. Her name on my phone screen was a thing I looked at for a moment before answering. Not because I was uncertain whether to answer, but because I was running, automatically, the small preliminary calculation of what she was likely to want and what I was and was not prepared to give. "Victoria," she said. Her voice was different from what I was accustomed to. The architecture of it was the same. The smooth, managed vowels of a woman who had been educated at the right schools and had spent 65 years in rooms that valued a particular kind of voice. but something in the foundation of it had shifted. It was the voice of a woman who has received information that has unsettled her and who is trying to manage that unsettlement without letting it be visible. "Eleanor," I said. "I've been told about the filing," she said. "Richard's attorney called Jeffrey." Jeffrey was Eleanor's personal attorney, a white-haired man in his 70s who had handled the Whitmore family's legal matters for 30 years, and who was, I had always thought, the human equivalent of a grandfather clock, imposing, expensive, and slightly out of date. And Jeffrey explained the nature of what you've submitted. "Good," I said. I wanted everything to be clearly documented. A pause. "Victoria." Her voice shifted again. Something softer coming into it, something that might, in a different context, have passed for genuine. "There are things in that filing that I want you to know that I was not aware of certain details. I want you to know that." I was very still. This was the first indication I had that Eleanor understood her own exposure. The Meridian Incorporation documents listed her social security number and her name. She was, legally speaking, the sole registered proprietor of a company that had received over $3 million in what I was characterizing, and what a federal prosecutor would likely characterize, as embezzled corporate funds. Whether she had known the full nature of what she was participating in, or whether Richard had presented the arrangement to her as something different from what it was a question that mattered a great deal to Eleanor and somewhat less to the Internal Revenue Service. "I appreciate you telling me that," I said. "I think if we could speak, if you and I could sit down without the attorneys." "I don't think that would be appropriate," I said. "Given that your name appears in several of the documents I've filed, Eleanor, I think any conversation we have should happen with legal counsel present, for your protection as much as mine." A silence. Then, "I see. I genuinely think you should speak to a criminal defense attorney," I said. "Not because I'm trying to frighten you, because I think you need one." I ended the call and sat for a moment, looking at the wall of my office where Lily's drawings were pinned to the corkboard above my desk. A drawing of Duke. A drawing of what appeared to be our house, rendered in orange crayon with a purple sky. A drawing Lily had made of me at my desk, in which I had enormous eyes and very straight posture, and was surrounded by what she had labeled, in careful 7-year-old handwriting, Mom's work papers. I thought about Eleanor on the other end of the phone, standing in whatever room she was standing in, holding the receiver, understanding for the first time the specific weight of a situation that had been constructed around her without her full comprehension. I did not feel sorry for her, but I felt something, a recognition perhaps, of the way that people who build their lives around someone else's power are always, in the end, vulnerable to that power in ways they do not foresee. I went back to the case law. I want to tell you about Lily. Not Lily as a character in the story of her parents' divorce. Not Lily as the child who needed to be protected. The child whose well-being was cited in every legal brief and every courtroom argument as though she were a resource being contested rather than a person living through something. I want to tell you about Lily as herself. Lily, at 9 years old, on a Tuesday evening in March, asking me whether we were going to have to get a smaller apartment than the one we were already in. "I like our apartment," she said. She was sitting at the kitchen counter eating the apple slices I had cut for her after school, arranging them in a pattern on the plate. "It has the good window." "The good window," I said. "The one that faces the tree," she said. "I can see the squirrel from that window. He lives in the tree. I've named him Gerald." "Gerald," I said. "He looks like a Gerald," she said, with the absolute conviction of someone who has considered the matter thoroughly. "Are we going to have to move?" I set down the knife I had been using and turned to face her. Lily was looking at me with the expression she has when she is asking a question she is not sure she wants the answer to. Her chin slightly down, her eyes looking up, the expression of someone bracing for impact while trying not to appear to be bracing. "I don't know yet," I said. "We might. If we do, we'll find somewhere with a good window." "With a squirrel?" "I can't promise a squirrel," I said. "But I can promise the window." She considered this. Then she went back to her apple slices. "Okay," she said, in the tone of someone who has reached an acceptable, if not ideal, resolution. "This is what I want you to understand about Lily." She processed the dissolution of her family's life with the combination of directness and adaptability that I have come to think of as her defining characteristic. And she did it largely without being told to. She asked questions when she had them and accepted the answers she was given without drama and without what I can only describe as the performance of suffering that adults sometimes engage in when they are managing difficult things. She cried once, in October, about Duke. Duke was, technically, my parents' dog. They had bought him for Lily's 7th birthday, but the logistics of apartment life had meant that he lived primarily in New Haven, with my parents, and visited us on extended loan. In October, Richard's attorney had included in a filing a claim that the dog was a marital asset and should be addressed in the settlement. Lily found out about this, not from me, but from an overheard phone call, because children always hear the things you're trying to protect them from. And she cried for 40 minutes in her bedroom with the door closed, which I knew because I sat outside the door and listened to her cry and did not knock, because she had closed the door, and closing the door is a decision that deserves to be respected even when the person who made it is 9 years old. When she came out, her face was very clean in the way of someone who has washed it thoroughly after crying, and she sat down at the kitchen table and said, "Nobody is going to take Duke, right?" "Nobody is going to take Duke," I said. "Because he's not a marital asset," she said. "He's a dog. He's Grandpa's dog. He lives with Grandpa." "That's correct," I said. "So they can't take him." "They can't take him." She nodded. "Okay," she said, and went to do her homework. I did not tell her that the dog issue had been one of 12 competing claims in a 40-page filing, or that it had been included specifically because Richard's attorney knew it would produce exactly the kind of emotional distress it had produced, and that emotional distress in a custodial parent can be documented and used. I did not tell her any of the machinery of what was happening around her. What I told her was, "We are moving through a hard time, and hard times end. And while we are in the middle of one, it is okay to feel whatever you feel about it." She took this guidance seriously, which is the best thing you can say about a child. I should tell you about the calendar. When I say I have documented things, I mean this literally and completely. I have kept a calendar, a paper calendar, a large wall calendar with squares large enough to write in, since Lily started kindergarten. In each square, I write what happened that day that was significant to Lily's life. School events, doctor's appointments, birthday parties, extracurricular activities. Who drove her, who attended, who picked her up. Over 4 years, this calendar contained 41 school or extracurricular events of significance: class plays, science fairs, the spring concert, the fall concert, the soccer games she played in for 1 season before deciding she preferred drawing, sports days, parent-teacher conferences, field trips that required parental chaperones. Richard had attended 9 of these 41 events. The 9 were all in the first 2 years of Lily's school life, before the demands of Whitmore Property Group's expansion had, as he described it to friends and colleagues, made it genuinely difficult to be as present as he would have liked. I did not keep the calendar as evidence. I kept it because it was Lily's life, and I wanted there to be a record of it, a document that showed, year by year, what her days had contained and who had been in them. The fact that it also constituted, in the context of a custody proceeding, a comprehensive record of Richard's absence was a coincidence that I had noted when I understood the calendar's potential evidentiary value, without surprise. Good records are always their own argument. I submitted the calendar to Judge Osei as Exhibit 31. It spoke for itself. The hearing was scheduled for the third week of April before Judge Patricia Osei. I spent the week before in a state of preparation so complete that Sophie told me on the Wednesday evening that I needed to stop rehearsing and sleep. "You know it," she said. We were in my kitchen, the cross-examination documents spread across the table between us, the remains of the dinner she had brought over, Thai food from the place on Farmington Avenue that Lily claimed made the best pad Thai in Connecticut, a claim she had based on a sample size of approximately 3 pad Thais, but delivered with the conviction of a food critic with 40 years of experience, pushed to the side. "Victoria, you know it. You've known it for months. You could answer his questions in your sleep." "I want to answer them better than in my sleep," I said. "You're going to answer them perfectly," Sophie said, "which is what worries me." I looked at her. "If you're too perfect," she said carefully, "if you're too controlled, it looks like you don't care. And a judge watching a custody case wants to see that you care." I thought about this. "I care enormously," I said. "I know that," Sophie said. "I've known that for 9 years. Judge Osei has known you for—" She looked at her watch. "Never. She needs to see it. You need to let some of it out." This is the thing about Sophie. She sees me so clearly that sometimes it feels like being seen is a physical sensation, something with texture and weight. She is right about the caring. I care so much that I have sometimes wondered whether the control I maintain over how I express it is a form of protection against how much it costs me, a way of managing the gap between the intensity of what I feel and the limited amount of time and space the world generally provides for feeling it. "I'll think about that," I said. "Think about Lily," Sophie said. "On the stand. Think about her face when she's talking about Gerald the squirrel. Just let that be on your face for a moment. The judge will see it." The night before the hearing, my father drove up from New Haven. He arrived at 9 in the evening carrying a thermos of my mother's ginger tea. She had made it that afternoon, he explained, specifically for tonight, because she knew I would not sleep well and ginger tea helps. And the expression he has worn at every significant threshold of my life. The expression of a man who is feeling more than he will say, and who trusts that presence communicates what words would only approximate. We sat at the kitchen table. I had my notes in front of me, the yellow legal pad with the final outline of tomorrow's case, the tabs of the binder color-coded and indexed. My father sat across from me with his thermos and his tea and his presents. At 11, Lily came out of her bedroom in her pajamas, hair in its nighttime braid, and climbed into my lap without asking. She is 9 years old and still does this, and I will not be the person who discourages it, not for a long time yet. She pressed her face against my shoulder. "Is Grandpa sleeping over?" she asked. "I'm heading back tonight," my father said. "I just came to bring your mom some tea." Lily lifted her head and looked at him with the serious assessment she brings to significant information. "She needs tea?" she said. "Everyone needs tea sometimes," my father said. Lily considered this. Then she climbed off my lap, walked around the table, and hugged my father with the wholehearted physicality of a child who has not yet learned to moderate her affections. My father put his arms around her and held her for a long moment with his eyes closed. When Lily went back to bed, my father and I sat for another hour in the quiet of the kitchen. The ginger tea was warm and tasted of my mother's kitchen on every difficult day I have ever had. At midnight, my father stood to leave. He put his hand on my shoulder. "Your grandfather came to this country with $40 and the clothes on his back," he said. "In Mandarin. Always in Mandarin for the things that matter. You come from people who do not quit." He drove back to New Haven. I went to bed. I slept 6 hours, which was one more than I expected. The morning of the hearing was bright and cold, The kind of April day that arrives in New England like an apology for the winter. The sky a clean, high blue, the air sharp enough to notice, the light falling across everything with the particular clarity of a day that has no fog in it. I dressed in charcoal and dark navy. I packed the binder. I made Lily's breakfast, oatmeal with cinnamon and blueberries arranged in a smiley face, and ate a piece of toast myself while standing at the kitchen counter. I was not hungry. I ate because Sophie had told me to eat before a trial, and Sophie is almost always right about the things she tells me to do. Sophie arrived at 7:30 to take Lily to school. She stood in the doorway and looked at me for a moment, the full, appraising look she has when she is doing her own private assessment of a situation. And then she said, "You look right." "Right how?" "Like yourself," she said. "Exactly like yourself." She took Lily's hand and they went down the stairs, and I watched from the window as they reached the sidewalk, and Lily turned back to wave up at me, her small hand moving against the morning sky. I raised my hand. She turned back and walked with Sophie toward the car. I picked up my briefcase. The courthouse was a stone building on Washington Street that had been built in an era when courthouses were designed to communicate permanence and authority through sheer mass. Walking toward it, I thought about how many people had walked toward it in states of fear and hope and exhaustion and desperation. How many of them had walked back out afterward with their lives changed in ways they had not predicted. The law is a strange instrument. It is crude in many ways and precise in others. It is deeply imperfect, and also the best system that has been devised for the problem it is trying to solve. I have spent my entire professional life inside it, and I have never entirely made peace with the gap between what it is and what it should be. But today, I believed in it. Today, I had given it 300 pages of truth, and I was going to stand inside it and let it do its work. Richard was already there. He was standing near the courtroom doors with Daniel Park, the two of them in a low-voiced conversation that stopped when I came into the corridor. Richard was wearing the navy brioni again, which I noted without expression. He looked, as he always looked in professional contexts, completely in control. The posture, the suit, the careful management of his face. He was performing, as he had been performing for 3 years, the role of a man who has nothing to hide. Eleanor was on a bench in the corridor, her crocodile bag on her lap, her posture as upright as ever. But when she looked up at me, I saw again what I had heard in her voice on the phone 2 weeks ago. The wariness of someone who understands, now, that the ground she has been standing on is not solid. "Victoria," Richard said when I reached the doors. He said my name in the tone of someone who is simultaneously performing generosity and issuing a warning. "It's not too late to—" "Good morning, Richard," I said. I said it pleasantly. I held the door open for myself and walked into the courtroom. Judge Patricia Osei had been on the bench for 22 years. She was 60 years old, Ghanaian-American, with close-cropped silver hair and a face that had, over 2 decades of presiding over the most intimate and often most dishonest moments of people's lives, arrived at an expression of composed authority that was neither warm nor cold, but simply exact. The face of someone who has decided that clarity of perception is the most important thing she can offer the people who appear before her. I had appeared before her twice in my career as an attorney of record, representing clients. The second time, she had paused at the end of a hearing and said, "Ms. Huang Ashford, your documentation in this case was exceptional." She had said it as a matter of fact, not as a compliment, which made it more meaningful than a compliment. She entered at exactly 9 o'clock. We stood and sat. She reviewed the case file with the efficient attention of someone who had done this 10,000 times, and then she looked up and surveyed the room once, quickly, and I had the specific sensation of being seen, really seen, assessed, taken account of, in the way that very few people are capable of producing in a single glance. "This is the matter of Huang Ashford versus Whitmore," she said. "Petitioner is present and self-represented. Respondent is present with counsel. We'll hear opening statements. Mr. Park. Daniel Park's opening was masterly. He had spent, I estimated based on the structure and the specific language, approximately 40 hours preparing it. Every sentence had been chosen. Every pause had been placed. He acknowledged, smoothly and preemptively, that the petitioner had raised financial questions that would need to be addressed, framing them as the understandable concerns of a woman who had limited professional exposure to the complexity of large commercial real estate operations and who had perhaps drawn premature conclusions from documents that required context to interpret correctly. He characterized Richard as a man of extraordinary dedication to both his family and his business. He mentioned Lily 4 times in 8 minutes, always in the context of Richard's love for her, his desire to be present in her life, his hope for a co-parenting arrangement that would serve her needs. It was very good work. It built a story. Stories are powerful things in courtrooms. They organize information into a shape that feels coherent and human and true. And the story Daniel Park was building was the story of a devoted father and a bitter wife, and a financial dispute that had been inflated by misunderstanding into something that looked, but only looked, like misconduct. I listened without expression and wrote on my yellow legal pad. Then I stood and delivered my opening in 3 minutes and 40 seconds. Your Honor, I am a licensed attorney with 12 years of experience in matrimonial and international asset litigation. I am representing myself in this proceeding because no one has more thorough knowledge of this case than I do. I have submitted 312 pages of financial documentation as my evidence disclosure. That documentation shows, with specificity and with sources, that my husband has been systematically concealing marital assets for a period of at least 3 years through a network that includes a Delaware shell company, an offshore trust in the Cayman Islands, and a cryptocurrency conversion process designed to make the funds untraceable. The amount concealed is approximately $2,800,000. I will present this evidence today. I ask only that the court review it carefully. I sat down. Judge Osei wrote something on the pad in front of her. I could not see what, but I saw her write it, and I saw the precision and deliberateness of the motion. Richard's testimony lasted 41 minutes. He was, as I have said, a gifted performer. He spoke about his love for Lily with a warmth that was technically accurate. He did love Lily. I had never doubted this. The love was real even if its expression had been inconsistent. And that was strategically deployed to establish the emotional register he wanted the judge to receive him in. He spoke about his business with the fluency of someone who has explained it many times and knows which parts of the explanation land and which parts glaze over. He spoke about me with a careful, regretful tone that positioned every criticism as a painful observation that he wished he didn't have to make. He described my financial accusations as genuinely mystifying and said that the Meridian payments were for legitimate consulting services that had been misconstrued by someone who didn't have the business context to understand what she was looking at. He said this without a flicker of visible discomfort, which told me everything I needed to know about the depth of his investment in the performance. He cried once, near the end. It was brief and controlled and precisely placed. At the moment when he spoke about missing Lily's soccer games because of a business trip that couldn't be moved, a trip I had subsequently confirmed, through the hotel records I had subpoenaed, had been to Miami, where Serena Collins had been at the same hotel, in an adjacent room, for the same 3 days. I wrote the timestamp of the crying on my legal pad. I wrote the word Miami beside it. When Daniel Park concluded his direct examination and said, "Your witness, Ms. Huang Ashford," I stood and walked to the podium. I had 14 questions. "Mr. Whitmore," I said, "you've described the payments to Meridian Advisory, LLC, as compensation for consulting services. Can you describe a specific deliverable that Meridian produced under its consulting agreement with Whitmore Property Group?" He named a document, a market analysis report. He described it in general terms. "Can you provide a copy of that report?" "My attorney has the documentation." I looked at Daniel. Mr. Park, can you produce the Meridian Market Analysis Report? Daniel looked at his papers. He looked at them for long enough that the looking became its own answer. I'd need to request it from my client's records team. Let the record note, I said, that no such document has been produced in discovery. I returned to Richard. Mr. Whitmore, can you name a single individual who worked at Meridian Advisory, LLC during the period it was being paid by Whitmore Property Group? A pause. Meridian operates as a consultancy. They use contractors. Can you name a contractor? Silence. Can you provide a business address for Meridian Advisory, LLC, other than the registered agent address in Wilmington, Delaware? Silence. Mr. Whitmore, are you the sole beneficiary of the Whitmore Cayman Trust? Richard's jaw tightened. I'd need to review. Your Honor, I said, turning to Judge Osei, I'd like to enter Exhibits 14 through 27. These include the Cayman Trust documentation identifying Richard James Whitmore as sole beneficiary, 26 months of wire transfer records linking Meridian Advisory, LLC to the Cayman Trust account, the Delaware Incorporation filing for Meridian, and the federal tax registration for Meridian, which lists as sole proprietor. I paused. Eleanor Patricia Whitmore. The room changed. It did not change gradually. It changed all at once, the way pressure changes when a seal breaks. A sudden equalization, a moment in which the air in the room is simply different from what it was a second ago. Eleanor made a sound in the gallery, a small, involuntary sound that she suppressed immediately, but not quite in time. Daniel Park went still in the specific way of a man who is running rapid calculations about his own professional exposure. Richard turned to look at his mother, and in that turn, in the quality of his attention and the quality of her face, I saw the complete architecture of what had been done between them. He had used her. He had used her name and her social security number and her signature on documents she may not have fully understood, and he had done it because she was the one person in his life he trusted to protect him, the one person who had always protected him, the one person whose instinct toward him was so deeply maternal that it had apparently not occurred to him that she might, one day, be asked to choose between protecting him and protecting herself. Judge Osei received the exhibits. She reviewed them with a focus so complete that the courtroom had the quality of a room in which time is moving differently from how it moves outside. A page turned. Another. The only sounds were the whisper of paper and the distant murmur of the building around us. After 4 minutes, she set the binder down and removed her reading glasses and looked at Richard. Mr. Whitmore, she said. Her voice had the quality I had heard from her twice before and that I had never forgotten. Not loud, not sharp, but dense, weighted. The voice of someone whose words carry the accumulated authority of 22 years of sitting in judgment over the worst and most revealing moments of people's lives. I am looking at documentation that shows a pattern of transfers totaling approximately $2,800,000 from your corporate accounts through a Delaware entity into a Cayman Islands trust of which you are the sole beneficiary. This documentation was not included in your financial disclosure to this court. I want to understand your explanation for that omission. Daniel Park was on his feet. Your Honor, my client, Mr. Park, Judge Osei said, I'm asking your client. Richard looked at me. For a long moment, 5 seconds, 6, he looked at me with an expression that I am still, sometimes, trying to fully understand. It was not hatred, though hatred would have been easier to categorize. It was not fear, though fear was certainly there. It was something closer to the expression of someone who was standing at the edge of a very high place and understanding, for the first time, what falling actually means. He opened his mouth. And then Eleanor stood up. She stood up from the gallery bench with the straight-backed posture she maintained at all times. And her voice when she spoke was not the warm, managed voice of the woman who had handed me condescension at dinner parties for 11 years. It was the voice of a woman who has just understood that the story she has been inside is not the story she thought she was inside. He told me they were estate planning documents, she said. Her voice was very clear, very precise, the voice of someone who wants to be correctly understood. He brought them to me in November, 2 years ago. He said that Jeffrey had recommended restructuring the family holdings for estate planning purposes. He told me that having my name on the formation documents was a formality, that it protected the family's interests in the event of, he said, in the event of any legal complications. The gallery was completely silent. He told me what to sign and where to sign it, Eleanor continued. I did not understand that I was signing as the proprietor of a company that was receiving. Her voice caught briefly, precisely once. That was receiving funds of this nature. Richard's face had gone a color I had not seen before. Not anger, or not only anger, something beyond anger, the place you reach when the last wall has come down, and there is nothing left to manage with. Mother, he said, stop. I will not stop, Eleanor said. I have spent 40 years protecting this family. I protected you after the Harmon Project failed. I protected you when the Vantage deal collapsed. I signed things you put in front of me because you were my son and I trusted you. She paused. Her hands, I noticed, were entirely still. I will not go to prison for you, Richard. Nobody is going to prison. Mr. Whitmore. Judge Osei's gavel came down once, sharp and final. You will be quiet. She looked at Eleanor. Mrs. Whitmore, anything you say in this courtroom may be used in proceedings beyond this one. I strongly recommend that you consult with an attorney before continuing. Eleanor looked at the judge. She looked at her son. She looked, finally, at me. In her eyes, I saw something I had not expected to find there. Not apology, exactly, but something adjacent to it. A recognition. The specific recognition of a woman who has spent a long time inside a certain story about her family and herself, and who is standing right now at the moment of understanding that the story was not true. She sat down. She sat down and opened her bag and removed a small compact mirror and checked her face in it with the automatic precision of a woman who has spent 65 years ensuring that her face presents correctly to the world. And then she closed the compact and put it away and folded her hands in her lap and looked straight ahead, and she said nothing more. Judge Osei called a recess of 90 minutes. I sat in the courtroom during the recess. The gallery cleared. The clerks moved papers. A maintenance worker came in and emptied the wastebasket near the side door. The room was very quiet. I sat at the petitioner's table, and I let myself, for 90 minutes, simply exist in the room without managing anything. I thought about Lily naming the squirrel Gerald. I thought about my mother at the kitchen table at 10 o'clock at night, bent over someone's hem with a needle and thread, making something damaged into something whole. I thought about my father's hand on mine on the courthouse steps. Or not that. He hadn't been at the courthouse. That image was from somewhere else, from New Haven, from the porch of my parents' house on a summer evening years ago. And I thought about the specific, irreplaceable quality of being known by the people who knew me first. I was not thinking about winning. I had never been thinking about winning. What I had been thinking about, for 8 months, was the truth. The truth of what had been done, and the documentation of it, and the exposure of it to a system designed, imperfectly and importantly, to take truth into account. The winning was a consequence of the truth, not the goal. The goal had always been the truth. Judge Osei's ruling was delivered at 3:58 in the afternoon. She read it from a prepared document, which told me that she had written it during the recess, that after 90 minutes of reviewing the evidence, she had known what she was going to do and had written it down so that when she delivered it, every word would be exact. I will not reproduce the full text here. I will tell you what it contained. full physical and legal custody of Lily to the petitioner, effective immediately. Supervised visitation for Richard, with terms to be determined based on a psychological evaluation that she was ordering. A freeze on all domestic and international assets belonging to Richard Whitmore and to the Eleanor Whitmore holdings pending a forensic audit by a court-appointed accounting firm. The marital home in Wethersfield to be returned to the marital estate and liquidated, with the equity distributed in its entirety, to the petitioner as compensatory damages for the documented financial fraud. A referral of the complete financial record, all 312 pages, to the United States Attorney's Office for the District of Connecticut for review of potential federal violations, including wire fraud, tax evasion, and the fraudulent use of another person's identity in a financial scheme. And then, before she closed, "Mr. Whitmore," she said, looking at Richard over her reading glasses, "this court has seen many forms of financial misconduct in divorce proceedings. What makes yours remarkable is not its complexity. It is in fact a fairly standard offshore concealment structure, and your wife, whose legal expertise you appear to have significantly underestimated, had very little difficulty documenting it. What makes it remarkable is the sustained contempt it represents. Contempt for this court, for the legal process, and for the woman you married, whose intelligence and capability you apparently chose to simply disregard." She picked up her gavel. "We're adjourned." The sound of the gavel in the empty room was the clearest thing I had heard in a very long time. I sat in the emptied courtroom for 11 minutes. I know it was 11 minutes because I checked my watch when the room cleared and again when I stood up. I did not plan the 11 minutes. I was simply not ready to leave yet, and I have learned, over the course of my life, that the moments you are not ready to leave deserve to be given the time they require. The light through the high windows had shifted in the hours since the morning. It was the amber light of late afternoon, the light that makes everything it touches look both more substantial and more fleeting than it is. The wood of the petitioner's table was warm under my hands. The yellow legal pads were full, both of them, front and back, with the careful handwriting I had been refining since the age of 8, when my father told me that clear handwriting is a form of respect for the reader. The binder was on Judge Osie's table. I looked at it from across the room. It was no longer mine to carry. It had become, in the hours of this day, something else. Evidence, record, document, the physical archive of 3 years of my husband's deception and 8 months of my patient dismantling of it. It belonged now to a process larger than both of us, a process that would continue without me, that would involve federal prosecutors and forensic accountants and the specific slow machinery of justice that grinds forward without drama or theater and arrives, eventually, at its conclusions. I stood up. I gathered my legal pads. I closed my briefcase. I walked out of the courtroom and through the corridor and down the elevator and out of the stone building into the April afternoon, where the air was clean and cold and tasted, I thought, a little like the beginning of something. I called Sophie. "It's done," I said. The silence on her end of the phone was the silence of someone trying not to cry and succeeding, barely. "Tell me," she whispered. "Full custody," I said. "Asset freeze, federal referral. The house comes back to the marital estate." A long exhale, then, "Lily. She's with you. She's been fine all day. She taught me 3 different ways to make a friendship bracelet, and she is extremely opinionated about which one is best." A pause. "Come get her." "I'm on my way," I said. The federal investigators contacted me the following week. 2 agents from the U.S. Attorney's Office arrived at my apartment on a Thursday morning, a man and a woman, both in their 30s, both with the particular quality of focused courtesy that distinguishes federal agents from local law enforcement, the quality of people who understand that they are building a case that will need to survive extended scrutiny and who therefore treat every interaction as part of the record. They sat at my kitchen table and I gave them coffee, and they asked questions that I answered accurately and completely, Marcus Webb had already reached out to their office through his own attorney, which I had known was likely. Marcus was not, at his core, a courageous person. He was a person who had been given an easy way to participate in something that benefited him. The nominal directorship of Meridian had come with an annual fee of $30,000, paid from the Meridian account, which appeared on his tax returns as consulting income, and who had not looked too closely at what he was participating in. When the looking became unavoidable, he cooperated. It was, all things considered, the intelligent choice. Eleanor retained a white-collar criminal defense attorney, one of the best in Connecticut, a woman named Margaret Fair who had spent 30 years handling exactly this type of case and who had, I was told, looked at the Meridian documentation and told Eleanor that her best available path was to cooperate fully with investigators and to establish clearly and thoroughly the nature of her son's deception of her. Eleanor, I believe, did not need to be told twice. Richard's indictment came in July. 3 counts of wire fraud, 1 count of tax evasion, 1 count of making false statements to a financial institution. His attorney, not Daniel Park, who had withdrawn from the case the week after the hearing, citing a conflict of interest that we both understood meant he was not willing to risk his license on a client who had lied to him, entered a plea of not guilty. The federal process is slow and thorough, and I will not prejudge its outcome here. What I know is what the documents show. The documents, as I have said, have always been the most reliable witnesses. Whitmore Property Group entered receivership in August. The commercial properties that had been acquired during our marriage were liquidated by the court-appointed receiver, and my equitable share of the proceeds, plus the compensatory damages the family court had ordered, was deposited into an account in my name in the first week of September. It was more money than my parents had earned in 30 years of combined work. I thought about them when I saw the number. I thought about the suitcases and the $400 and the apartment on Shelton Avenue. I thought about the drafting table and the alterations and the engineering examination taken twice in a borrowed language. I thought about what it meant that the money existed, not because I had earned it in the same way they had earned theirs, but because I had known what I was owed and had known how to prove it, and those 2 things were possible because of everything they had given me. The specific and irreplaceable inheritance of people who understood that knowledge is the only thing that cannot be taken from you. I called my mother and told her the number. She was quiet for a moment. "Good," she said. "Now come home for the weekend. I'm making dumplings." I found the house on a Saturday in late August, 3 weeks after the settlement funds were deposited. I was not, officially, looking for a house. I had decided to take 6 months before making any major decisions. Sophie's advice, sensible advice. The advice of someone who knows me well enough to know that my version of a major decision is so thoroughly researched as to constitute a small doctoral thesis, and that beginning that process 6 months earlier than necessary is a way of spending energy that could be spent on other things. But I drove past the house on the way home from Lily's Saturday morning drawing class. She had taken it up in the spring and showed a specific aptitude for architectural line drawing that I chose not to read too much into. And the for sale sign was at the end of the driveway, and I pulled over. It was a colonial 4 bedrooms on a street with oak trees in West Hartford, not unlike the house in Wethersfield, in its bones. But where the Wethersfield house had always felt, to me, like a house that had been chosen by someone else and that I had moved into rather than made my own, this house felt different. It was older, a little less maintained, the garden somewhat overgrown in the way of a garden that has been waiting for someone to pay attention to it. The oak trees in the backyard were enormous, the kind that have been there long enough to have developed personalities. Lily was beside me in the car. She had been looking at the house from the passenger seat. "It has a good tree," she said. "It does," I said. "Is that the kind of tree you can climb?" "I think so." "We should get it," she said, with the decisiveness of someone for whom the tree argument is complete and no further discussion is required. I called the listing agent that afternoon. We were in the house by October. Lily and I planted the garden in the first week of October, which is late for most things, but exactly right for the garlic and the tulip bulbs and the spring-blooming perennials that would lie dormant through the winter and emerge in April into exactly the kind of surprise that a garden is best at providing. We worked side by side in the October afternoon, Lily in rubber boots that were one size too large and a hat she had chosen herself, orange, with ears, digging the holes with a small trowel while I followed behind with the bulbs. "How deep?" she asked. "About 3 times the height of the bulb," I said. She considered the garlic clove in her hand. "That seems like a lot." "It needs room to grow," I said. "It needs the cold of the winter to do what it needs to do, and then in spring it comes up." She dug the hole. She placed the clove. She covered it carefully, patting the soil down with both hands. "That's kind of like us," she said. I looked at her. She was already moving to the next hole, the orange hat with ears slightly askew, entirely absorbed in the task. "How so?" I said. "We went through the cold part," she said matter-of-factly, the way she says things that are simply true and that she does not think need elaboration. "And now we come up in spring." I sat back on my heels in the garden of our new house and looked at my daughter and thought, not for the first time, that she was the person in this story who had understood it best. Not the legal strategy, not the financial architecture, not the machinery of evidence and disclosure and courtroom procedure, but the essential shape of it, the cold and the dark and the necessary patience, and then the coming up. "Yes," I said. "Exactly like that." It is a Saturday in late October, 6 months after the hearing. The oak trees in the backyard have gone full amber. Not the showy red that comes first, but the deep, steady gold that comes after. The color that has always felt to me like the truest color of October. The color that says, I was here all along. My parents are here. My father is sitting at the kitchen table with his engineering journal and his tea, his knee elevated on a cushion. He had surgery in August and is still recovering, the physical recovery of someone who is being patient with a process that is slower than he would like. My mother is in the kitchen, reorganizing my spice cabinet, which she does every time she visits and which I have stopped commenting on, because the reorganization is always, I will admit privately, an improvement. Lily is in the backyard with Duke, my parents' dog, who has been living with us since August, when it became clear that my father's recovery made it difficult for him to give Duke the exercise he needed, and that Lily's devotion to the animal was, at this point, the primary factor in Duke's quality of life. She is trying to teach him to fetch a specific stick she has selected on the grounds that it is the right size, a criterion she has not elaborated on. Duke is tolerating this with the benevolent dignity of an elderly dog who understands that his role in the family is partly ceremonial. I am on the back porch steps with a cup of tea. The sun is low and the yard is all that amber gold, and Lily's voice carries across it clearly, her instructions to Duke patient and detailed, and the sound of it, the specific, unrepeatable sound of my daughter's voice in our backyard on an October afternoon, is the thing I have been working toward, without knowing precisely what it would sound like, for the past 8 months. My father comes out and sits beside me. He moves carefully, his knee still tender, but he lowers himself onto the step with the deliberate calm of someone who has learned to move through difficulty without complaint. He picks up his tea. We watch Lily. "She looks like you," he says, in Mandarin. "She has his smile," I say. A pause. My father gives everything the consideration it deserves. "Yes," he says. "But she has your eyes, the way she watches things." He gestures slightly toward her. "She misses nothing." "She doesn't," I say. Duke has abandoned the fetching project and is lying in the grass with his chin on his paws, watching Lily with the adoration of an animal who has found his person and intends to remain in her vicinity indefinitely. Lily is sitting beside him, not doing anything in particular, just sitting in the afternoon light with her hand on his back. "Are you all right?" my father asks. The same question my mother asked me on the phone in February at midnight when I called to tell her. In this family, this question means something specific. It means, I am paying full attention. Tell me the true version. "Yes," I say. And then, because he has always deserved the full version, I think I genuinely am. He puts his hand over mine on the step. His hand is the hand I have known my whole life. The hand that pressed my shoulder before my first day of school, that turned pages of engineering textbooks at a kitchen table in New Haven, that held Lily when she was an hour old with a care so total it was almost painful to witness. We sit together in the afternoon light. I think about what it means to build something. Not in the way Richard meant it, the accumulation of property and capital and the external markers of a life that has won, but in the way my parents meant it, the way I am only now learning to fully articulate. Building as the patient, sustained commitment to things that are true. Building as the decision, made again and again in the small hours and the long weeks and the cold months, to keep working toward something even when the working is invisible, even when no one watching would know that progress is being made. The weight of paper, the 300 pages in the binder, the documents and the records and the timestamps and the routing numbers, the yellow legal pads filled with careful handwriting, is the weight of truth. Truth that was always there, waiting to be found. Truth that required patience and precision, and the willingness to keep looking even when the looking was hard. I found it. I carried it. I put it down. And now I am sitting on the back steps of my house in the amber light of October, watching my daughter and my parents and the dog who has chosen her. And the weight I am carrying is not the weight of evidence or strategy or the long, patient work of building a case. It is just the weight of a life, which is, I have found, exactly enough. There are things I want to say to you before I finish, because I am aware that this is a story about a particular kind of survival, and I do not want to leave you with only the shape of it without the substance. I had advantages. I want to be honest about this. I had a legal education and 12 years of professional experience and the specific, irreplaceable knowledge of how financial concealment is built and how it is dismantled. I was able to conduct this investigation myself. I was able to stand in that courtroom. Not every woman in a situation like mine has these things, which is why, and I mean this not as a postscript but as the point, financial literacy matters, not the advanced forensic kind, the basic kind. The kind that means you know what is in your accounts and whose name is on your property and what you have signed and what those signatures mean. The kind that means you cannot be handed a document and told it is something other than what it is. Richard's power over me was, in the end, built on my consent to not know, on the small decisions, accumulated over years, to let him manage the visible things. Those decisions were understandable. They were the decisions of a tired, busy person who trusted her partner and who was, in those years, focused on other things. I do not condemn them. But I have thought, many times, about the woman I might have been if I had maintained, from the beginning, the independent financial knowledge that I eventually used to dismantle what he built. Know your accounts, know your assets, read what you sign, and if something doesn't make sense, look at it more carefully. The truth is almost always in the numbers, and the numbers are always there, waiting to be read by someone who knows how,